This is episode number 146 of the Guns Magazine podcast. Hi there, and welcome to the Guns Magazine podcast, one of the shooting world's most listened to gun talk programs. I'm your host and the editor of Guns Magazine, Brent Wheat. Thanks for joining us as we talk to the interesting folks who make up the world of shooting, hunting, law enforcement, and the firearms industry. First, before we get started, I'd like to ask you to take a second and subscribe to the podcast while I share a few words about our sponsor, 1791 Gunleather. Centuries ago, the original patriots of this country fought and died for the promises they protected in the Constitution. Chief among those promises was the right to bear arms. Now, generations later, 1791 protects that right and our firearms. Makers of the 2020 Holster of the Year, every 1791 holster is a mastery of craft and function, customizable to any firearm you require. 1791 Gunleather provides quality and service in the way only an American company can. Please visit 1791gunleather.com for more information. There's been lots of information passed around about the Uvalde, Texas school shooting, and frankly, most of it is suspect at best and a pack of lies at worst. In today's episode, I talked to Suzi Huntington, a retired police officer, and the former editor of American Cop magazine about her research into the incident and how the response of law enforcement perhaps wasn't as bungled as the mainstream media and online social posts would suggest. Now here's Suzi Huntington talking about the Robb Elementary school shooting. Well, good afternoon, Suzi.
Good afternoon, Brent.
How are you this fine day? We talked to Roy, I think, was it last week? And you guys are getting over the vid, but apparently doing okay.
We are doing fine. You know, he got poked. I decided not to poke. So I did the ivermectin protocol, and I will not ever have worms again. I guarantee you.
Wow. There's so much there that we're not going to touch. Well, I appreciate you joining me today. We've actually kind of discussed this before. First of all, the reason you're joining me, if folks don't know you, you're the former editor of American Cop magazine. You are a retired San Diego police officer. You had a reputation as being a butt kicker out on the street. You were a hard charger and very interested in officer survival and tactics and all that kind of stuff, which makes you the perfect guest to talk about a pretty unpleasant subject, but I think it needs discussed, and that is the Uvalde, Texas, the Robb Elementary School shooting, which happened on May 24th, 2022. But more than just we've all heard stuff and we've all seen stuff, you actually went in and read that long report that the Texas House of Representatives wrote up following that, which is kind of the Bible of the response and things that happened there. So we're going to dive into that today, and I will say before we even get started, we both hate Monday morning quarterbacking, but there are some lessons to be learned here, and that's what we're going to talk about. So, Suzi, I got to ask the big white gorilla in the room question. Everybody in the media, a lot of folks, a lot of my friends, well, those cops are cowards. There's 300 cops, and they're all cowards, and they were standing around afraid to go after this guy. Do you really think that's the case?
No. And to be more pointed, that's a crock of crap. It's not true. They were not cowards. Not at all. They like any other emergency of this nature, they went running toward the gunfire and the screaming, not away.
So then that leads to the question, so where did it break down?
Well, the very first breakdown of all of this is squarely resting on the shoulders of the Uvalde, the Robb Elementary in particular, staff.
Really?
Absolutely.
And they've received virtually no criticism because they're victims. So it's interesting that they share some culpability in this whole thing. Why do you say that?
To be fair, they have received some criticism. It is not getting the attention that the quote unquote failure of law enforcement has received. And we all know that everybody likes to sit and watch YouTube and get little snippets of an incident. And then, you know, with their wealth of tactics background, weigh in on how the cops were wrong. And it's just not true. This all broke down as a result of that staff. And I'm not painting with the same broad brush that we paint all of law enforcement. I'm not saying all staff and school teachers, et cetera, are bad people. This particular school, there's some huge responsibility that needs to be taken.
Well, I thought it was fascinating when I was doing my research before we had this talk. They just held active shooter training at that school 2 months before this incident. So hopefully all these folks understood the threat and had been trained in how to deal with the threat. And then we saw what happened 2 months later.
I think there's still a bit of the it's not going to happen here mentality. And so even though you train, you're not truly vested in it because you still, in your heart of hearts, think this could never happen here.
Yep.
It'll happen somewhere else.
And, I'm sure you've seen it. I've seen it when I was a police officer. You go to training, especially tactical type training, and most of the officers take it very, very seriously. But there's that percentage that they truly say, well, I'm not going to be in a shootout. I'm not going to be in a car crash. I'm not going to be in a fist fight. And unfortunately, many of them learned they were wrong. Do you think, again, that was kind of this whole mindset of, yeah, we know it could happen, but it's not going to happen here in Uvalde, which is, there's only 15,000 people in the town. They're 80 miles west of San Antonio and just about 50 miles from the border. A quiet little nice place to live, apparently. So it wouldn't happen there, would it?
No, it's a tiny town. But when you mention the fact that they are so close to the border, they actually have had a huge uptick. That's one of the things in this report. They've seen a big increase in bailout activity over the last 18 months.
Really?
Specifically around the school. So the takeaway from that is they have in place, a notification system for shutdowns. Well, if you think of how much increase there was in bailout activity, what happens is it becomes almost like the tornado sirens here.
Yeah.
They're tested. You get accustomed to the noise. You just kind of blow it off. And then when it really goes off, you're fat, dumb, and happy and not really paying attention to it. And I think that's what was happening here at the school.
So before we get too far along, though, go back to the school, some of the staff, talk about specifically some of the things they didn't do or did do that if we have, say, teachers listening to us, maybe this would ring true with them that, well, maybe when they tell me to lock my door or watch this or whatever, maybe I really should. But talk about some of those things that probably should have been done but weren't.
So all three of the exterior doors, if I recall, there were three of them. They were not locked.
Wow.
Every single one of them was open, unsecure. That's a direct violation of their protocol.
Did they identify who was supposed to do that or where that failed?
That was a failure from upper management all the way down to custodial.
Wow. Because it's not going to happen here and somebody else will take care of it anyway, right?
I think some of the excuses that were being given was, well, if there's a substitute teacher, they don't have the keys. And gosh, I just get tired of having to go back and forth and unlocking and locking doors. And or there's the teacher who says, I've forgotten my keys or I've lost my keys or God knows how many copies of the keys are out floating around. Yeah. The bottom line is you're not securing your facility.
Exactly. So the shooter, and I'm not even going to mention his name to give him any more infamy, which those people crave, but he basically walked in and I'd read in a media report, so take that with a giant grain of salt, that he had actually done a considerable amount of scouting and pre-planning down to where he talked to family members to ask when they went to lunch and kind of how that whole thing worked. Did the report address any of that?
I believe it did. But again, too, we're seeing failures within his family and failures within his circle of friends for his behavior, his rather odd behavior, and posts that he did on social media. People failed to say something.
Well, and again, multiple media reports, so I'm fairly confident there's some grain of truth in this. His nickname was School Shooter. I mean, if your friends are calling you that, I mean, you would think when somebody starts acting out more and more and more, maybe somebody should say something.
You think?
I read one person said, well, I thought that I could help him. Well, that's admirable. But if you think somebody's going to do something like this, you got to say something. He was the suspect, or not suspect, he is the shooter. He was never on law enforcement's radar, was he?
I don't believe he was on their radar. Obviously, he was able to purchase those guns legally. And there again is something that now, because he did it legally, we're going to beat up the system for the fact that he did everything right. And even go to the extent of saying, oh my gosh, how could a kid without a job afford a Daniel defense gun? Here's my answer to that. Who gives a crap?
Yeah.
He's been saving for a long time.
Yeah.
I don't know. He had savings accumulated and he purchased a gun. Doesn't matter whether he can afford it or not.
Yeah.
He passed all the checks.
Well, let's get into specifically the police response. Uvalde has 6 school police officers. I don't know how many the city or county has. I've read notes here that by the time this thing was over, there was almost 300 police officers, but 150 of them were Border Patrol, 91 of them were state police. So I can only imagine from my own experience and yours too, there was probably a lot of confusion right there. Guys and gals that had never seen each other, never worked with each other, different radio frequencies and terminology and equipment. So there was a lot of confusion from the get-go, but I'm reading where there was about 19 officers inside during that initial incident. Talk about kind of your understanding once this shooter got to the school, kind of how it went down until we got to that infamous pause where everybody decided that they were going to stand around.
Okay, so his day actually started out pretty early. He shot his own grandmother and after shooting her, took her vehicle and headed towards the school. He crashed the car in a culvert right near the school, next to a funeral home. And it was a couple of gentlemen inside that funeral home that came out having heard the crash and I think seen something on their camera system, went out to render aid, only to have him pop up out of the truck and shoot at them. So he's already shooting.
Right.
He's already a committed shooter. He immediately then makes a beeline for the fence at the school and climbs over the fence where there is a teacher outside with students. And she sees his backpack come flying over the fence and him follow shortly after. She, of course, turns tail and tells everybody, run away, get away. So they're running towards the school.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So he's popped over the fence, collects his bag. And I believe he's taken some shots in the direction of the parking lot as he's heading towards the school buildings.
Mm-hmm.
He's already committed. We know he's going to be shooting.
Right.
Because he's done it. As the teacher and students make their way into the school, the alert goes out. So everybody should be going into lockdown mode.
Mm-hmm.
Once he's inside, of course, I don't think this teacher had the presence of mind to lock the door.
Right.
Because he did just waltz right in. And he made an absolute committed path from where he came in to the 4th grade room. And apparently it's the classroom he was in when he was in 4th grade too.
Right. When apparently his life took unpleasant turns and there's some speculation that's why he went there.
Yeah, and of course, we'll never know. He's taking that to his grave way far down south.
Where it's warm.
Where it's very warm, yes. So he's made, that's where I'm going. This is my little special place. And I believe from the time he came over the fence to the time he entered that classroom, and I believe they estimated he shot over 100 rounds the moment he walked into that classroom.
My.
And the officers are already responding to the area because of the call from the funeral home about the crash and shooting. So they're already going to that call when the calls start pouring in from the school. Well, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that this is probably somehow related.
Right.
So they divert off over to the school. I believe those officers that were first on scene were already going down and trying to make entry into that room in something like 2 minutes. How come we didn't hear about this in the news?
Exactly.
I mean, it doesn't fit the narrative of what was constantly being reported, that the cops were just standing outside trying to figure out what they were going to do and preventing other people from going in. Well, you had, 200 some odd cops there?
Mm-hmm.
There was confusion. Granted, I'll give you that. But there were officers inside. And so your outside officers it's not one of those things where it's not like European football where we all pile on the guy, right? No, you have people that need to keep things under control outside too. And I'm not saying that I agree with everything they did out there. We don't have to agree with it. We weren't there, so we don't know what was really going through everybody's mind, right?
Right.
So you have the officers that go down to this classroom. Now, the shooter has a clear, distinct advantage. One way in and out of that classroom, and he's trained on it. So the door opens. Well, what are you going to do if you're sitting there waiting for the door to open?
Yep.
Yeah. He shoots at them. Okay. Back away.
Yeah.
Regroup. You don't back away and then decide, we're just going to keep sending people and see how many of us he can pop off.
Yeah.
Right? Is that tactically sound?
Not at all.
No. So you cannot call these officers cowards. They ran to the shooting. I don't believe in my heart of hearts, nor in my logical thinking, that they could have saved anybody in that room. I don't think it could have happened. And that's a bitter pill. People don't want to hear that. They want to say, well, the cops should have saved us.
Yeah.
Or saved them. But that's a bitter pill. I don't think they could have. I think the deed was already done. And it was just a matter of how long before he surrenders or he gets killed.
Yep. You have just put voice to what I've wondered all along, that, these people were dying. I'm guessing, and this is just based on logic.
Already dead.
Exactly. So I understand, as a police officer, as a supervisor, and just as a cognizant human, that if you're pretty sure this is a barricade and you are way behind the power curve, like you said, it's not like we keep throwing more bodies, the lowest ranked guy, hey, charge in that door, and if you get shot, we'll know that he's still shooting. So, I
mean, it's crazy.
Yeah.
You don't call people cowards because they didn't save the unsavable.
Right. And, I get it from the parent standpoint. They've lost their children. They're going to say things. And where I blame is the news media for picking all that up, providing no context, and repeating the most outlandish things that anybody said as fact.
I feel horrible for all of the people involved. I feel horrible for the parents whose children were killed. I feel horrible for the law enforcement officers who were there and had to deal with this. I mean, I get it. Nobody forces us to go into that line of work. Okay. But it's still a horrible thing to have to deal with. I feel that there has been a limited amount of anger, frustration expressed at the school and the staff. I don't think, from a larger standpoint, from what people are being fed on social media and in the news, that anger is actually being placed correctly, because we're still making this a law enforcement narrative. We could not have prevented this from happening. We can only react to it. We reacted, I believe, for the most part, appropriately. Yes, the chief of the school police has resigned. And he was forthright in saying that he didn't handle it as an active shooter scenario.
Right.
He thought he was going in as a hostage scenario. He admits that he didn't handle that right. And quite honestly, I think I can understand where he's coming from, because you've already had things quiet down drastically.
Mm-hmm.
You don't hear hundreds of screaming children. Apparently they didn't hear that. And there was also misinformation being passed around from cop to cop to cop. But I mean, he fell on his sword. He should have.
Yeah.
He made the wrong call. But how many times have you and I been involved in something where maybe we didn't make the right call? Granted, it's not to this level. I mean, nobody died in any of my wrong calls, but you make a bad choice.
Well, I read something very fascinating now in the after action. The chief, first of all, he's been criticized for not having a radio. He intentionally abandoned both of his radios with the express intent he didn't want them to slow him down. He was en route to shoot the gunman himself. That was his goal, and that's why he didn't call himself the incident commander, because he felt like he was committed on the front lines, and that's not the place for an incident commander to be. Now, should he maybe excused himself, gone outside, whatever, that's, again, maybe one of those decisions, but he's been painted as this idiot just standing around. And after you read, again, his intention was to go in and take this guy down, and it just didn't work out that way. So now that I hear that, I can certainly understand his focus and mindset. And again, as the Supreme Court has said, you can only judge the police by what they knew or believed at the time. Gunfires rang out. He's going down there to do what he was trained to do, and it didn't work out that way. But just that picture that's been painted of him as this moronic, cowardly guy, essentially hiding in the broom closet, that's not the case at all.
It's not the case. He actually had written into their policies that if there was an active shooter, that he would be the scene commander. I think he wavered a little bit on the I got this, I'm the commander. Because again, I'm not necessarily sure he believed that this would ever happen.
Yeah.
Because if he had, I think he would have been quick to take more decisive action.
Sure.
And good gravy. I don't want to kick the guy in the teeth. He had a huge responsibility dumped in his lap. And again, I'm going to keep going back. This never would have happened at the level it did had that school been more secure.
Yeah. Yep.
Not just the outside doors, but the interior doors. It was not uncommon for interior doors to be left propped open. Okay, if your door is locked, yes, he could shoot his way in, but he wouldn't just waltz in immediately and start going at it.
Well, and even if he has to shoot his way in, that at least gives you some notice that, hey, I hear gunfire. That's probably a bad thing. Maybe we should, do some of the stuff we've been told about.
Right. I'm trying to read through here. So the crash that occurred in the culvert near the funeral home was at 11:28 in the morning.
Mm-hmm.
Lockdown was given at 11:32 a.m.
Wow.
It shows surveillance video in the hallway shows the attacker fired his gun toward rooms 111 and 112 at 11:33 a.m. Okay, so you have barely 5 minutes has transpired from the video of him crashing in the culvert to I'm making my way into the classrooms at 11:33. Now, please, somebody out there, tell me how any of this was going to be prevented, and how would any officers have already been there to thwart what had happened? Now, could he have been slowed down if he was locked out? Absolutely. He could have been slowed down. He could have, it could have been a slow down for him that he decided to go do something else. I don't know. This is where we can kind of, extrapolate into the absurd, but I think people's attention and angst needs to be focused more at staff, because they say the words that they want to keep these children safe, but then they don't do the very minimal standards and protocols that were put in place to keep those kids safer.
Because it's not going to happen here. And how many times, going back to, again, our law enforcement experience, how many times you dealt with victims that it's unreal. I can't believe this happened to me. Well, that's because it did. And you're like everybody else. You can be a victim too, unfortunately. And folks don't understand that, do they?
No, they don't. According to the analysis provided to the committee, after entering, the attacker spent about 2.5 minutes rapidly firing over 100 rounds between the two rooms, ultimately killing many innocent victims. It's a lot of rounds in short amount of time.
Yeah, at least one reload, more likely 2 or 3 reloads.
Probably.
Let's talk a little bit about the confusion. I talked about that earlier. Over half the folks there were federal officers, more than half. Everything from the school police to the local police of various flavors to federal agents, Border Patrol, state police. You've been on a lot of scenes with multiple agencies. Talk a little bit about how that can affect the operation and outcome of something, especially something that's evolving rapidly.
Well, everybody's on their own radio frequency. I know that there are mutual frequencies that can be used. Generally speaking, though, you need to have a dispatcher get it set up so that they are acting as dispatch. I think we had Claymars and Alamars, but there's a lot of different radio frequencies, and depending upon where each person from different agencies is getting their information, you can see how quickly the misinformation can get spread around quickly. It's like, there was an old kids show where they started out with 10 children and the host told the first child something. Mm-hmm. And by the time it got to the 10th child, it was completely different.
Yeah.
So apply that with law enforcement and how quickly somebody's interpretation of what they were just told gets changed to the next one.
Exactly. And what a lot of folks don't understand, if you've not been in the military or a paramilitary type organization like law enforcement, just because you're standing next to somebody with a rifle, if you don't know them, if you've never met them, trained with them, if they say, we need to go do this, you're ingrained to think, well, what does my supervisor or boss want me to do? We operate as we're told to do. And there are certainly times you have to take individual initiative, and this might have been one of them. But the point being is, if you're with a bunch of folks you don't know, never met, don't work with, that throws another layer of complexity on it, because it's ingrained literally from day one of the academy that, well, you only do what you're told to do by your bosses.
True. I think since Columbine was another good example of how communication broke down, even within just the few agencies that were responding to that. Communication is going to be a huge factor. I'm not sure how it gets mitigated to become something that is more easily handled. I'm looking here at some other notes. So I think I just said by 11:33, he'd already shot over 100 rounds just in those two rooms. At 11:37, the officers were converged on the outside of these rooms.
Wow.
To make entry.
That's quick.
4 short minutes. Now, I don't see a whole lot of cowardly behavior here in the fact that they are already there within 4 minutes of his shots ringing out. How many people know that? How many people have bothered to read this report?
Exactly. Well, in the time we've got left, a word that you keep bringing up in our conversations before this is leadership. Talk a little bit about maybe what leadership should have done and how leadership maybe could have changed the outcome for a better outcome, or at least not make law enforcement look so bad to so many people.
Well, good gravy. Chief Arredondo, I don't know. I mean, that guy would have wanted, if I were him, I would have wanted to have just crawled under a rock.
Yeah.
I think he was, if you're a Star Trek fan, he was in the Kobayashi Maru of shooting incidents. There was no correct way for him to handle this.
Yeah. What would you, if you're talking to the officers that were out there in the hallway, your thoughts?
That was just a terrible situation for them to have to enter that room. There is so many fatal funnels leading up to that door.
Sure.
And then you have the king of all fatal funnels, a door that is the only way in and out. And you have a shooter in there. You're going to be met with gunfire. And they were met with gunfire. And I think people then say, well, but it took them over an hour to finally go in there again. Yes. But I don't believe there was any shooting within that classroom going on. It was truly just a standoff at that point.
Yeah.
And I think they were waiting for more substantial means so that they could open the door and have something more than just their pumpkin heads between them and the end of the shooter's gun.
Yeah.
So I thought that the officers did everything that they should have done to get down there. Again, you don't just keep sending more and more officers in only to have them be shot in order to go after this guy. As far as the hallways and everything was pretty empty at that point. It was just mostly the officers that were in the hallway and converging on the room. Outside, obviously, what you want your people to do is keep things as calm, if that's a possibility. You want to keep them as free of chaos as possible. And if that means that, yes, you're having to push people back and do those things, I don't see any problem with it. I know people have made a big stink over arrests being made because people were trying to force their way in.
Yeah.
My question is, what good would it have done to have any of those people inside going after their child in that classroom? Then you'd have a dead parent and they'd blame you for that too.
Well, Suzi, I appreciate that you have done all this research. We'll make sure and put the link to this Texas House of Representatives Investigative Committee report so people can read it for themselves. Before we go, I will say that we've talked about some of this. Episode number 134 of the podcast, we talked about active shooter survival, and that was myself and your lovely husband, Roy Huntington. And then in episode number 142, we kind of talked about this and touched on it in Are We Making Cops Cowards? And episode number 144, having the back to school talk with your kids, because I didn't realize until one of my own grandchildren was worried about going back to school because they were afraid that somebody's going to come in and shoot them too. So unfortunately, the concerns of today are different than when you and I were in school. Well, Suzi, thank you very much for your insight and your research into the Uvalde school shooting.
I just hope people read this report. It's chock full of information, and guess what? You can make your own decisions versus having it spoon-fed to you by lamestream media. Just read it. Nobody's hiding anything.
Great point. Great point. Well, thanks.
Thanks, Brent.
I know Suzi Huntington contradicted the quote-unquote narrative about Uvalde and the cops, but I hope you'll take the time to read the report, which I've linked below, and make up your own mind. If there's a topic you want to hear, someone you'd like us to interview, or you want to share your thoughts about things, please drop me a line at editor@gunsmagazine.com. As always, you can find us on your favorite podcast directory, YouTube, and at gunsmagazine.com. I'd also like to remind you to subscribe so you don't miss out on any of our great episodes. And while you're online, don't forget to check out our great sister publications, American Handgunner Magazine at AmericanHandgunner.com, AmericanCop.com, and our numerous special editions available for sale on our websites and at Amazon. Right now, the hot ticket is the DIY Guns Home Gunsmithing Projects number 30. Well, that's it for this episode of the Guns Magazine podcast. For the entire staff at FMG Publications, I'm Guns Magazine editor Brent Wheat. Now get out there and get shooting.